The pewter plates rattled against the oak table as another invisible force swept through the Stockwell cottage. Mrs. Golding pressed her trembling hands to the rough wooden surface, watching helplessly as her earthenware pitcher lifted into the air, suspended for one impossible moment before crashing against the stone hearth. The fragments scattered across the rush-strewn floor like scattered bones in candlelight. It was past midnight on this January evening in 1772, and the phantom had been tormenting the household for 3 days. The servant girl, Anne Robinson, cowered in the corner as chairs scraped across flagstones of their own accord. Pots and pans danced in the kitchen shadows, while the fire guttered low, casting writhing silhouettes on whitewashed walls. Mrs. Golding's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. The cottage groaned around them as if the very timbers were alive with malevolent purpose. Through frost-glazed windows, the narrow streets of Stockwell lay silent under winter stars, unaware that within these walls the natural order had been shattered. What had begun as mysterious knockings had escalated into a supernatural siege that would soon draw crowds of curious Londoners to this modest dwelling, all seeking answers to South London's most confounding mystery. Chapter 1. The Cottage at Stockwell. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time through the veil of centuries to a winter's evening when the very air crackled with mystery. This is the Bedside Historian, and tonight we journey to South London in the year 1772, to witness events that would shake the foundations of rational thought. Whether you listen from beneath warm covers in New York, by a dying fire in Edinburgh, or perhaps in the small hours before dawn breaks over Tokyo, the darkness connects us all. Time means little when we travel together through these forgotten corridors of history. If this is your first visit to our channel, please do consider subscribing. Your support helps these stories reach other souls who find comfort in the shadows of the past. Now, settle deeper into your pillows. Close your eyes if you wish. The candles are guttering low, and we have much ground to cover before dawn returns. Our tale begins in Stockwell, a modest village that had not yet been swallowed by London's ever-expanding embrace. The cottage stood unremarkable among its neighbours along Stockwell Terrace, a narrow lane that wound between market gardens and modest dwellings. Built of local brick and timber in the previous century, it possessed the solid, honest construction typical of homes meant for the working classes. 3 rooms downstairs, 2 above, with a kitchen garden behind where winter cabbages struggled against the January frost. Mrs. Sarah Golding had let the property for nearly 2 years, keeping a tidy household with the help of her niece and a single servant girl. At 43, she was a woman of middle years whose husband's death had left her with modest means but considerable determination. She took in needlework from the great houses, mended and altered garments for neighbours, and managed her small domestic world with the quiet efficiency of one who had learned that survival demanded both thrift and vigilance. The servant girl, Anne Robinson, had arrived in November of 1771, a thin creature of perhaps 20 years, whose pale complexion and nervous manner suggested she had known hardship. She possessed no family connections in London, having travelled from some distant county where work had grown scarce. Mrs. Golding had taken pity on the girl's circumstances, offering her employment for room, board, and 6 shillings per quarter. Anne's duties encompassed the endless tasks that maintained a household, rising before dawn to tend the fire, hauling water from the well in the courtyard, preparing simple meals, scrubbing floors, washing linens, and emptying chamber pots. She worked with silent diligence, speaking little and keeping her thoughts to herself. Mrs. Golding found her satisfactory, if somewhat strange. The girl possessed an odd habit of talking to herself in whispers, and occasionally would pause in her work as if listening to voices no one else could hear. The winter of 1772 had arrived early and stayed late. Snow had fallen before Christmas, and lingered well into the new year, coating the narrow streets of Stockwell with a treacherous layer of ice that made walking hazardous. The Thames, visible from the higher windows of the cottage, ran grey and sullen between banks lined with frozen reeds. Coal was dear, and Mrs. Golding rationed their fuel carefully, keeping fires only in the kitchen and the front parlour where she did her sewing. It was in this atmosphere of pinched domesticity and winter isolation that the first manifestations began. On the evening of January 6th, 1772, the Feast of Epiphany, Mrs. Golding sat in her parlour working on alterations to a gentleman's coat. The fabric was fine wool, deep blue with silver buttons, and she handled it with particular care. Such work, when completed satisfactorily, might earn her as much as half a guinea. Anne Robinson moved about the kitchen, washing the supper dishes by candlelight and banking the fire for the night. The first disturbance came as a sound, 3 distinct knocks on the wall between the parlour and kitchen, as if someone were striking the interior surface with a closed fist. Mrs. Golding looked up from her needle, frowning. The sound came again. 3 measured raps that seemed to travel along the wall from floor to ceiling. "Anne!" she called, setting aside her work. "Are you moving furniture?" The girl appeared in the doorway, her hands still wet from the washing basin. "No, ma'am. I heard it too. Thought perhaps someone was at the door." They waited in silence, listening to the winter wind rattling the shutters. The knocking came a third time, not from the door or windows, but seemingly from within the walls themselves. Mrs. Golding rose and walked to the dividing wall, pressing her ear against the whitewashed plaster. The surface felt cold, almost unnaturally so, as if touched by frost despite the fire burning just feet away. "Likely the timbers settling in the cold," she murmured, though her voice carried little conviction. Old houses speak in winter. But the speaking had only just begun. Over the following day, the knocking returned with increasing frequency. Not random or chaotic, but measured, deliberate, as if responding to some unheard conversation. Mrs. Golding found herself pausing in her work to count the raps, sometimes 3, sometimes 7, occasionally a long series that seemed to follow a rhythm she could not quite grasp. Anne Robinson grew increasingly agitated. The girl started at every sound, dropped dishes with alarming frequency, and twice Mrs. Golding found her standing motionless in the kitchen, staring at the walls with wide, frightened eyes. "What is it, child?" Mrs. Golding asked on the second occasion. "You look as though you've seen a spectre." "Sometimes," Anne whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Sometimes I think I hear my name being called, but when I listen carefully there's nothing, just the sound of my own breathing." Mrs. Golding felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January weather. She was a practical woman, raised in the Church of England with a healthy scepticism of superstition, but she could not deny the strange atmosphere that had settled over her home. The cottage felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her sleep restless. On the evening of January 8th, the phenomena escalated beyond mere sounds. Mrs. Golding sat at her kitchen table, sharing a simple supper of bread, cheese and small beer with Anne. The girl ate little, pushing food around her wooden plate while glancing nervously at the shadows cast by their single candle. Outside, snow began to fall again, large flakes drifting past the frost-glazed window like ghostly moths. The first pewter plate moved while Mrs. Golding was reaching for the cheese, a slight tremor at first, barely perceptible, as if someone had nudged the table. Then the plate began to slide slowly and deliberately across the scarred oak surface until it reached the edge and tumbled to the floor with a metallic clatter. Anne gasped and pushed back from the table. Mrs. Golding stared at the fallen plate, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. No earthquake could have caused such precise movement. No settling of the house could account for the plate's purposeful journey across smooth wood. "Did you see?" she began, but her words were cut short as the second plate followed the first, sliding with the same inexorable momentum until it too crashed to the rush-strewn floor. Anne whimpered and crossed herself, a gesture that in normal circumstances would have earned her a sharp rebuke from her Protestant mistress. But these were no longer normal circumstances. Mrs. Golding found herself reaching for the comfort of any available protection, whether Anglican or Catholic or pagan. The earthenware pitcher was next. It rose from the table not gradually, but with sudden, decisive motion, as if lifted by invisible hands. For one impossible moment it hung suspended in the air above their heads, water droplets falling from its rim like tears. Then it launched itself across the kitchen to shatter against the stone hearth, sending fragments skittering across the floor in all directions. The candle flame guttered but did not die, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent purpose. The temperature in the room plummeted so suddenly that both women's breath began to mist in the air. Mrs. Golding felt ice crystals forming on her eyelashes and heard the unmistakable sound of water freezing in the washing basin. Anne Robinson began to sob, great heaving breaths that echoed strangely in the frigid air. "It's following me," she whispered between gasps. "It followed me here. I thought if I came to London, if I found honest work, it would leave me be. But it's here, and it's angry." Mrs. Golding turned to stare at her servant, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to form in her mind. "What followed you, Anne? What do you mean?" But before the girl could answer, every pot and pan in the kitchen began to rattle against the walls where they hung. The sound built from a gentle tinkling to a thunderous cacophony, as if a giant hand were shaking the entire cottage. Wooden spoons danced in their crock, pewter cups rolled across shelves, and the fire in the hearth flared so high that sparks shot up the chimney like miniature shooting stars. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos that had preceded it. Even the wind outside seemed to have died away, leaving them in a pocket of unnatural quiet that pressed against their ears like deep water. Mrs. Golding's hands trembled as she reached for Anne's shoulders. The girl was shaking so violently that her teeth chattered, and her skin had taken on an unhealthy greyish pallor that made her look like a corpse in the uncertain candlelight. "Tell me," Mrs. Golding whispered, her voice hoarse with fear and growing understanding. "Tell me what you brought into my house." Anne's story emerged in broken fragments over the next hour, as they huddled together in the parlour before a fire that seemed unable to truly warm the air around them. The girl spoke of strange occurrences that had plagued her since childhood. Objects moving without cause, unexplained sounds in empty rooms, cold spots that appeared without reason, and voices that called her name in languages she didn't recognize. Her family had endured these manifestations for years, she said, but the phenomena had grown stronger as Anne approached womanhood. Neighbours began to whisper. The local parson visited their cottage, performed prayers and blessings that seemed only to enrage whatever force surrounded the girl. Crops failed in fields where Anne walked. Livestock grew nervous in her presence. Children refused to play with her, and their mothers crossed themselves when she passed. Finally, when Anne was 19, her own father could bear no more. He gave her what money he could spare and told her to seek her fortune elsewhere, anywhere else, as long as it was far from their village. She'd hoped that distance would break whatever connection bound her to the supernatural manifestations. For a time, as she made her way to London through a series of temporary positions, the disturbances seemed to have ceased. But now, in the depths of a London winter, in Mrs. Golding's modest cottage in Stockwell, the phenomena had returned with renewed vigour. As Anne spoke, Mrs. Golding found herself studying the girl with new eyes. There was nothing obviously unusual about her appearance. Brown hair, pale complexion, thin build made more pronounced by poor nutrition and hard work. Her hands were rough from labour, her clothing simple and well mended. She looked like any of 1,000 servant girls who worked in the great city, unremarkable in every visible way. Yet something invisible clung to her, some force that defied explanation or classification. Mrs. Golding had heard stories, of course. Every village had tales of cursed individuals who drew supernatural attention, people around whom strange things happened without apparent cause. She had always dismissed such stories as superstition, the product of ignorant minds seeking simple explanations for random misfortune. Now she found herself reconsidering every assumption she had ever made about the nature of reality. The phenomena continued throughout that long night, though with less violence than the initial outbreak. Objects moved with purpose but without malice, as if whatever force controlled them was establishing its presence rather than seeking destruction. The fire in the hearth burned with unusual colours, sometimes blue, sometimes green, casting eerie illumination on the walls. Footsteps could be heard in the rooms above, though both women remained in the parlour throughout the dark hours. Mrs. Golding dozed fitfully in her chair, starting awake at every sound. Anne did not sleep at all, sitting rigid with her hands clasped in her lap, watching the shadows with the desperate attention of a condemned prisoner awaiting execution. Dawn came slowly, grey light filtering through frost-covered windows to reveal a transformed domestic space. The kitchen showed clear signs of the previous evening's disturbances. Broken crockery swept into corners, pots and pans scattered across the floor, chairs overturned and tables askew. Yet nothing appeared to have been damaged beyond the initial outbreak. The destruction seemed almost considerate, as if whatever force was responsible had taken care not to create more mess than necessary. Mrs. Golding surveyed the chaos with the calculating mind of a housekeeper. The broken pitcher and plates could be replaced, though it would cost her dearly. The scattered pots were undamaged and could be cleaned and returned to their proper places. The real question was whether she could continue to harbour a servant who seemed to attract supernatural attention wherever she went. But as she watched Anne Robinson carefully sweeping fragments of earthenware into a dustpan, moving with the mechanical precision of someone trying desperately to maintain normal routines in abnormal circumstances, Mrs. Golding found she could not bring herself to turn the girl out. Where would Anne go? What employer would take in a servant who came with such terrifying baggage? More practically, what would happen to Mrs. Golding herself if she sent Anne away? Would the phenomena follow the girl, or had they somehow taken root in the cottage itself? The thought of facing such supernatural manifestations alone was almost more frightening than enduring them with company. As the morning progressed, an uneasy peace settled over the household. The mysterious disturbances seemed to retreat with the daylight, leaving behind only an atmosphere of watchful tension. Mrs. Golding attempted to return to her needlework, but found her hands too unsteady to manage fine stitches. Anne went through the motions of her daily tasks, but every few minutes would freeze and cock her head, as if listening to voices only she could hear. By afternoon, word of the strange occurrences had begun to spread through Stockwell. Mrs. Parsons from the cottage next door knocked at the kitchen door, ostensibly to borrow a cup of flour, but clearly hoping for gossip. Mrs. Golding found herself caught between the desire for normality and the need to prepare her neighbours for whatever might come next. "Such odd sounds last evening," Mrs. Parsons observed, her small dark eyes bright with curiosity, almost like furniture being moved about. "I hope nothing was amiss." Mrs. Golding forced a smile that felt like broken glass on her lips. "Nothing that couldn't be set right with daylight and a broom," she replied, technically truthful if woefully incomplete. But Mrs. Parsons was not so easily satisfied. Her gaze moved past Mrs. Golding to where Anne Robinson stood frozen by the kitchen fire, and something in the girl's posture seemed to confirm whatever suspicions the older woman harboured. "That new girl of yours," Mrs. Parsons said carefully, "she seems troubled. Has she been eating properly? Sometimes poor nutrition can cause all manner of nervous conditions." The suggestion hung in the air like incense, offering Mrs. Golding a rational explanation she desperately wanted to accept. Nervous conditions, malnutrition, perhaps even some form of hysteria that could manifest in ways that seemed supernatural to the untrained eye. But even as she grasped at these conventional explanations, Mrs. Golding remembered the sight of the earthenware pitcher hanging motionless in mid-air, defying every law of nature she understood. No amount of poor nutrition could account for objects moving without physical cause. No nervous condition could make pewter plates slide across solid oak with purposeful intent. After Mrs. Parsons departed with her borrowed flour and her head full of speculation, Mrs. Golding sat at her kitchen table and tried to plan their next steps. The cottage felt different now, charged with potential energy like the air before a thunderstorm. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant. The ordinary domestic space she'd inhabited for 2 years had become something else entirely, a stage upon which forces beyond human comprehension were beginning to perform. Night fell early in January, darkness creeping through frost-covered windows to reclaim the cottage from daylight's temporary protection. Mrs. Golding lit candles with reluctant hands, knowing that each flame would cast shadows where invisible watchers might gather. Anne Robinson moved through the evening routine of banking fires and securing shutters, but her movements had acquired a brittle quality, as if she were a clockwork figure whose spring had been wound too tightly. As the church bells of Stockwell marked the hour of 8 o'clock, the phenomena began anew. This time, the manifestation started not with violence, but with something far more unsettling: the sound of children laughing. The laughter seemed to come from the walls themselves, high and clear, and utterly incongruous in a cottage inhabited only by 2 frightened women. It echoed through the rooms like sunlight, joyful and innocent, and completely at odds with the atmosphere of dread that had settled over the household. Mrs. Golding and Anne looked at each other across the kitchen table, sharing a moment of bewildered terror that needed no words. Whatever force haunted them had revealed a new aspect of its nature, one that was perhaps more disturbing than simple malevolence. There was intelligence here, and worse, there was playfulness. The laughter faded, leaving behind a silence that felt expectant, as if the cottage itself were holding its breath. In that moment of suspension, Mrs. Golding realized that their ordeal was only beginning. What had started as mysterious knocks and moving objects was evolving into something far more complex and threatening. And somewhere in the depths of that growing dread, she understood that soon their private terror would become a public spectacle, as word of the Stockwell hauntings spread beyond their small circle of neighbours to draw the attention of all London. The night stretched before them, full of shadows and possibility, while outside the first snow of a new storm began to fall. Chapter 2: The Servant's Secret. The morning light crept through the diamond-paned windows of the Stockwell cottage, casting geometric shadows across the debris-strewn floor. Mrs. Sarah Golding knelt among the shattered remnants of her earthenware pitcher, her weathered fingers tracing the jagged edges with the careful attention of one cataloguing loss. The rush matting beneath her knees bore dark stains where wine had spilled in the night, mingling with fragments of pewter and ceramic to create a mosaic of domestic destruction. Anne Robinson stood motionless by the kitchen hearth, her young face pale as morning frost. The servant girl's rough woolen dress hung loose about her slight frame, the coarse fabric bearing testament to her lowly station in this household of modest means. Her hands, reddened from endless scrubbing and washing, trembled as she clutched a wooden bucket to her chest like a shield against the inexplicable forces that had transformed their quiet dwelling into a battlefield between the natural and supernatural worlds. The cottage itself bore witness to the night's torments in every corner. Oak beams groaned overhead, as if still recovering from invisible assaults, while the stone hearth displayed fresh scorch marks where flying objects had struck the ancient masonry. The familiar sense of wood smoke and tallow candles could not quite mask an underlying odour of sulphur that seemed to cling to the very walls, as though the boundary between this world and some darker realm had grown thin within these timber-framed chambers. Mrs. Golding rose slowly, her joints protesting after the sleepless night. She had dwelt in this corner of Stockwell for nigh on 20 years, ever since her husband's death had left her with little choice but to take in lodgers and servants to maintain her modest independence. The cottage, with its low ceilings and narrow rooms, had always been a place of quiet industry and careful economy. Now it felt violated, transformed into something alien and threatening by forces beyond her comprehension or control. The widow's eyes fell upon Anne Robinson with growing scrutiny. The girl had arrived at her doorstep barely 6 months prior, seeking employment as a domestic servant. She'd come with references from a household in nearby Vauxhall, though Mrs. Golding now found herself questioning whether those testimonials had revealed the full truth of the girl's character and history. There was something about Anne's manner in recent days that troubled her mistress, a furtiveness that seemed to deepen with each supernatural manifestation. Anne had claimed to possess no knowledge of the disturbances when they first began 3 nights past. She had cowered and wept convincingly when the initial knockings echoed through the cottage walls, her terror appearing genuine as furniture moved of its own accord and kitchen implements took flight through the cramped rooms. Yet Mrs. Golding could not shake the suspicion that the girl's fear masked something else entirely, perhaps even a dark satisfaction at the chaos engulfing their humble dwelling. The morning brought no respite from the strange phenomena that had plagued them through the winter darkness. As Mrs. Golding attempted to sweep the broken crockery into her wooden dustpan, the fragments scattered across the floor as if pushed by invisible hands. The broom handle grew cold beneath her grip, so frigid that her fingers ached with the touch of it. She released the implement in alarm, watching as it toppled slowly to rest against the oak settle that dominated one wall of the main chamber. Anne Robinson remained frozen by the hearth, her gaze fixed upon some point beyond the frost-covered windows that faced the narrow lane. Her breathing came in shallow, rapid bursts that misted in the unnatural chill that had settled over the cottage like a burial shroud. Mrs. Golding observed how the girl's lips moved silently, as though she were engaged in some private conversation with forces invisible to mortal sight. The peculiar cold that permeated the dwelling defied all natural explanation. Though Mrs. Golding had banked the fire carefully before retiring the previous evening, and though fresh logs crackled merrily in the grate, the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the supernatural frost that clung to every surface. Ice crystals formed along the interior walls despite the flames that danced mere feet away, creating delicate patterns that resembled nothing so much as skeletal fingers reaching toward the shadowed corners where darkness lingered even in daylight. Throughout the cottage, objects continued their restless movement. The carved wooden crucifix that hung above the mantelpiece swayed gently despite the absence of any draught, while the brass candlesticks upon the oak table shifted positions when no human hand touched them. Mrs. Golding's collection of pewter plates, those that had survived the night's destruction, rattled intermittently against their wooden shelf, as if responding to some unheard rhythm or melody that echoed from realms beyond mortal perception. The widow's suspicions regarding her servant deepened as she recalled the girl's behaviour in recent weeks. Anne had grown increasingly withdrawn, often found staring into empty corners or speaking in hushed tones when she believed herself unobserved. She'd taken to wearing a small leather pouch around her neck, claiming it contained medicinal herbs for her frequent headaches, yet Mrs. Golding had detected strange odours emanating from the mysterious bundle, scents that reminded her unpleasantly of the village wise woman who had been driven from Stockwell years past amid whispers of witchcraft and diabolic congress. The girl's knowledge of the cottage's layout and the precise location of every valuable object also struck Mrs. Golding as suspiciously comprehensive for one so recently arrived in her service. Anne seemed to anticipate which items would be targeted by the supernatural disturbances, moving away from furniture moments before it began its otherworldly dance across the flagstone floors. Her tears, while seemingly genuine, came at precisely the moments when witnesses gathered outside the cottage windows, drawn by rumours of the strange phenomena occurring within these humble walls. As the morning progressed, the manifestations grew bolder still. The iron pots suspended from hooks above the kitchen fire began to swing in measured arcs, their blackened surfaces catching the firelight as they moved through the smoky air. The wooden trenchers that served as plates lifted from their shelf and arranged themselves in neat rows upon the scrubbed oak table, as though invisible guests had arrived to partake of some phantom feast. Mrs. Golding watched in fascination and growing terror as her few precious possessions became players in this supernatural drama that had transformed her modest dwelling into a stage for forces beyond human understanding. The temperature within the cottage continued to plummet despite the roaring fire, until both women could see their breath misting with each exhalation. Frost began to form upon the interior surfaces of the windows, creating intricate patterns that blocked their view of the outside world and increased their sense of isolation within this pocket of otherworldly activity. The very air seemed to thicken around them, growing heavy with the presence of something vast and malevolent that pressed against the boundaries of the visible world. Anne Robinson finally broke her silence, her voice barely above a whisper, as she spoke words that chilled Mrs. Golding more thoroughly than the supernatural cold that gripped their dwelling. The girl claimed to hear voices in the walls, murmuring conversations in languages that predated the Christian faith that had shaped their Georgian world. She described visions of shadowy figures that gathered in the corners of her bedchamber, watching her sleep with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness of winter nights. Mrs. Golding found herself torn between compassion for the girl's apparent distress and growing certainty that Anne Robinson possessed knowledge of these disturbances that she refused to share. The servant's arrival had coincided too precisely with the onset of the supernatural activity for mere coincidence, and her behaviour suggested familiarity with forces that no God-fearing Christian maiden should comprehend. Yet the widow hesitated to voice her suspicions directly, fearful of provoking whatever dark powers had already claimed dominion over her peaceful cottage. The pewter candlesticks upon the mantelpiece began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the flames that flickered nearby. The metal grew warm to the touch, then burning hot, until the very air around them shimmered with heat that provided no comfort in the supernatural winter that had descended upon the dwelling. Mrs. Golding backed away from the phenomenon, her heart racing as she contemplated the implications of such impossible manifestations occurring within her own humble walls. Outside the cottage, the ordinary world of 18th century Stockwell continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the extraordinary events unfolding within these timber-framed walls. Merchants called their wares through the narrow streets, while housewives hurried past with baskets of provisions for the midday meal. The normality of life beyond the cottage windows served only to emphasize the otherworldly nature of the disturbances that had claimed this particular dwelling as their domain, creating a pocket of supernatural activity in the heart of Georgian London's growing suburbs. As the morning wore toward noon, both women became aware of gathering voices beyond their frost-covered windows, the murmur of curious neighbours drawn by whispered reports of strange phenomena. Mrs. Golding felt a mixture of dread and relief at the prospect of witnesses to validate her experiences, yet she feared what conclusions these observers might draw regarding the source of the supernatural disturbances that had transformed her modest cottage into South London's most confounding mystery. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge everything the Georgian world believed about the boundaries between natural philosophy and supernatural forces, with Anne Robinson standing silent at the centre of the unfolding drama, her secrets locked behind eyes that reflected depths no serving girl should possess. Chapter 3. The Witness Arrives. The morning frost clung to the diamond-paned windows of number 20 Clapham Road as word of the Stockwell disturbances began to spread beyond the confines of Mrs. Golding's troubled cottage. January's bitter grip had settled over South London like a shroud, and the cobbled streets gleamed with treacherous ice beneath the weak winter sun. Chimney smoke rose in pale columns from the modest dwellings that lined the thoroughfare, each household awakening to another day of honest labour, unaware that supernatural forces had taken residence mere streets away. Mrs. Payne, a respectable widow of middle years who kept lodgings in nearby Vauxhall, first heard whispers of the strange occurrences during her weekly visit to the market at Stockwell Common. The gossip spread like ripples across still water, passed from baker to fishmonger, from housemaid to cook, each telling growing more elaborate with each retelling. Pewter plates, it was said, had taken flight like autumn leaves caught in a gale. Furniture moved of its own accord, dancing to music only the dead could hear. A serving girl had been struck by invisible hands, leaving marks upon her flesh as real as any earthly violence. Mrs. Payne possessed the particular blend of scepticism and curiosity that marked the educated merchant class of Georgian London. Her late husband had been a man of letters, leaving her with both a comfortable independence and an inquiring mind sharpened by years of his philosophical discussions. She had witnessed the great earthquake that shook London in 1750, felt the very foundations of the city tremble beneath divine wrath or natural force, depending upon one's theological inclinations. She had observed the aurora borealis dancing across London's skies in scarlet splendour, phenomena that sent the superstitious fleeing to their churches, while natural philosophers reached for their instruments. Yet the tales emerging from Stockwell possessed a quality that distinguished them from common tavern stories, or the fevered imaginings of gin-soaked minds. The witnesses spoke with the trembling conviction of those who had gazed upon something beyond the boundaries of natural law. Mrs. Golding herself, known throughout the neighbourhood as a woman of unimpeachable character and Methodist sobriety, had been observed fleeing her own dwelling in the grey hours before dawn, clutching her prayer book and weeping with terror. The decision to investigate came to Mrs. Payne as she sat in her parlour that Thursday evening, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the spine of her husband's books. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters with skeletal fingers, and somewhere in the distance the bells of St. Mark's Church tolled the hour with funereal solemnity. She had always prided herself on facing the unknown with rational courage, whether it be the yellow fever that had swept through London's docks, or the mob violence that periodically erupted in the capital's darker quarters. The following morning found her wrapped in her warmest cloak, picking her way carefully along the frost-slicked stones toward Mrs. Golding's cottage. The January air bit at her exposed skin with vicious teeth, and her breath formed spectral clouds that dissipated quickly in the crisp atmosphere. Other figures moved through the morning gloom, their footsteps echoing hollowly against the walls of sleeping houses. A milkmaid hurried past with her burden of earthenware jugs, casting nervous glances toward the Golding dwelling, as if expecting demons to pour forth from its very walls. The cottage itself appeared deceptively ordinary in the weak morning light, built of honest brick and timber in the style common to South London's working classes. It possessed none of the Gothic grandeur that popular novels associated with supernatural manifestations. No gargoyles leered from its eaves, no ivy crept across its walls in sinister embrace. Instead, it presented the humble face of respectability, with clean windows and a freshly painted door that spoke of Mrs. Golding's pride in maintaining proper appearances despite her modest circumstances. Mrs. Payne approached the dwelling with measured steps, noting the unusual stillness that seemed to hang about the structure like morning mist. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the bitter cold, and the windows remained shuttered against the pale daylight. The very air seemed to thicken as she drew near, taking on a quality that reminded her of the oppressive atmosphere that preceded thunderstorms in summer. Her knock upon the door echoed with surprising resonance, as if the sound travelled through chambers far larger than the modest cottage could contain. Long moments passed before footsteps approached from within, shuffling and hesitant. When the door finally opened, Mrs. Golding's face appeared in the gap, pale as parchment and marked by the deep lines that come from sleepless nights and constant fear. The two women regarded each other across the threshold, one seeking answers, the other desperate to provide them to any soul brave enough to listen. Mrs. Golding's hands trembled as they clutched the doorframe, knuckles white with the force of her grip. Her usually neat brown hair hung in dishevelled strands about her shoulders, and her simple woolen dress bore the wrinkles of garments worn too long without changing. Behind her, the interior of the cottage lay in shadow and silence, yet Mrs. Payne detected an underlying tension in the air, as if the very walls held their breath in anticipation. The familiar sense of a working household, bread, soap, wood smoke, were present, but somehow muted, overlaid with something else that she could not immediately identify. It was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, merely alien, like the smell of rain on foreign soil. Mrs. Golding's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the hoarse quality of one who had spent too many hours in prayer or weeping. She welcomed Mrs. Payne with the desperate gratitude of a castaway greeting a rescue vessel, ushering her quickly inside and barring the door behind them as if to keep pursuing demons at bay. The cottage's interior revealed the evidence of supernatural visitation in overturned furniture and scattered household goods, yet Mrs. Payne observed that efforts had been made to restore some semblance of order. The kitchen hearth stood cold and empty, its stones blackened not merely by ordinary use but by something that had burned with unnatural intensity. Shards of broken crockery lay swept into neat piles, awaiting disposal, while chairs and tables bore the scars of violent impacts. Upon the oak mantelpiece, a few surviving pewter plates were arranged with careful precision, as if their owner hoped that maintaining proper appearances might somehow restore normalcy to her disrupted world. Anne Robinson emerged from the shadows like a wraith, her young face bearing the hollow expression of one who had looked upon wonders too terrible for mortal comprehension. The servant girl moved with the cautious steps of a creature perpetually ready for flight, her dark eyes darting constantly toward corners where nothing visible lurked, yet something seemed always to watch. Her hands, Mrs. Payne noted, bore fresh scratches and bruises that formed no pattern recognizable to earthly violence. The morning progressed with Mrs. Golding's halting recitation of the events that had transformed her peaceful dwelling into a theatre of supernatural chaos. Her words came in fragments, broken by long pauses as memory forced her to relive moments that challenged the very foundations of Christian understanding. She spoke of sounds that had no earthly source, of objects that moved in defiance of natural law, of presences that manifested through cold touch and invisible assault. As the widow listened, she found herself studying not merely the words, but the manner of their telling. Mrs. Golding possessed neither the theatrical inclinations that might suggest deliberate deception, nor the scattered wits that marked minds unhinged by circumstance. Instead, she displayed the methodical precision of one determined to record truth regardless of its impossibility, her account rendered with the care of a court witness, testifying before judges whose verdict might mean life or death. The serving girl's testimony, when it came, proved even more disturbing in its simplicity. Anne spoke in the plain language of her station, unadorned by education or imagination, sufficient to conjure such elaborate falsehoods. Her description of invisible hands that struck and grasped, of furniture that danced in empty rooms, of voices that whispered in languages unknown to human tongues, carried the weight of lived experience rather than invented fancy. Outside, the winter day progressed with agonizing slowness, marked by the distant chiming of church bells and the occasional passage of carts along the cobbled street. Yet within the cottage, time seemed suspended, held captive by forces that recognized no earthly authority. Mrs. Payne found herself glancing repeatedly toward the windows, seeking reassurance in the ordinary world beyond the glass, even as her rational mind struggled to process testimony that challenged every assumption upon which civilized society rested. The afternoon brought new visitors, drawn by curiosity and the irresistible human compulsion to witness the impossible. A local minister arrived first, his black robes rustling with ecclesiastical authority as he crossed the threshold bearing prayer book and holy water. Behind him came merchants and craftsmen, their faces bearing expressions of skepticism, warring with fascination. Each newcomer listened with the same progression of emotions, doubt giving way to unease transforming into fear as the accumulating evidence overwhelmed rational resistance. Yet even as the cottage filled with witnesses, the presence that had terrorized its inhabitants remained mercifully quiet, as if waiting for some signal known only to itself. The very silence became oppressive, pregnant with potential energy like the calm that precedes the hurricane's fury. Mrs. Payne observed how conversations gradually died away, replaced by nervous glances and unconscious drawing together of bodies seeking comfort in human proximity. As evening approached and shadows began to lengthen across the floor, Mrs. Golding's agitation visibly increased. Her hands fluttered like trapped birds, and her gaze darted constantly toward the corners where darkness gathered first. The servant girl pressed herself against the wall nearest the door, ready to flee should supernatural forces resume their assault upon the natural order. The assembled witnesses waited in growing tension as daylight faded beyond the frost-glazed windows, each wondering whether they would be granted peaceful departure or forced to confront phenomena that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of Georgian rationality. In the deepening gloom, Mrs. Payne reflected upon the courage required to seek truth in an age when truth itself might prove more terrifying than the most elaborate fiction ever conceived by mortal imagination. Chapter 4. The Weight of Testimony. The morning light filtered through frost-etched window panes as word of the Stockwell disturbances spread beyond the narrow confines of the cottage walls. Mrs. Golding found herself facing an unexpected burden as curious neighbours began appearing at her door, drawn by whispered accounts that had travelled through the taverns and market stalls of South London like smoke on winter wind. The servant girl, Anne Robinson, remained at the centre of these mysterious occurrences, her presence seeming to herald each new manifestation of the inexplicable forces that had taken residence within the household. On this fourth morning since the troubles began, she moved about her duties with the careful deliberation of one walking across thin ice, every gesture measured against the possibility of triggering another supernatural outburst. Mrs. Golding observed the girl with growing unease. Anne's dark hair hung in loose strands around her pale face, and her hands trembled slightly as she attended to the morning fire. The young woman's eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and waking terrors, yet there remained something indefinable about her manner that Mrs. Golding could not quite place. Perhaps it was the way Anne seemed to anticipate each disturbance moments before it occurred, or how she positioned herself in rooms as if guided by some invisible compass toward the epicentre of the coming chaos. The cottage itself bore the scars of the previous night's activities. Pewter plates lay scattered across the kitchen floor where they had fallen after their mysterious flight through the air. Chairs remained overturned in corners where unseen hands had flung them during the darkest hours before dawn. The very atmosphere seemed to pulse with residual energy, as if the walls themselves retained some memory of the supernatural forces that had coursed through them. Mrs. Golding had spent the early morning hours in quiet contemplation, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she sat beside the dying embers of the hearth. The rational part of her mind sought explanations rooted in the familiar world of Georgian London, yet the evidence of her own senses defied such comfortable reasoning. She had witnessed furniture moving without human touch, had felt the sudden drop in temperature that preceded each manifestation, had heard the knocking sounds that seemed to emanate from within the very structure of the building. As word of the disturbances spread throughout the neighbourhood, Mrs. Golding found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of guardian to a mystery that grew more perplexing with each passing hour. The first visitors arrived shortly after the church bells had tolled 8 o'clock, their faces bearing expressions of mingled scepticism and fearful curiosity. Among them was Mr. John Fowler, a respected member of the local parish who had come at the urging of his wife to assess the situation with the measured eye of a rational man. Fowler was a gentleman of middle years whose profession as a clerk in one of London's counting houses had trained him in the careful observation of details and the weighing of evidence. He entered the cottage with the bearing of one accustomed to dealing in facts and figures, his powdered wig precisely arranged, and his dark coat brushed to perfection despite the early hour. Yet within moments of crossing the threshold, his composure began to show signs of strain as the peculiar atmosphere of the place made itself known to his senses. The morning's first manifestation occurred as Mrs. Golding was explaining to her visitors the pattern of disturbances that had plagued the household. A heavy earthenware jug that had been resting securely on the kitchen dresser suddenly lifted into the air with no visible cause, hovering for several heartbeats before dashing itself against the opposite wall with tremendous force. The crash echoed through the small rooms like thunder, and the fragments scattered across the flagstone floor with a sound like breaking bones. Mr. Fowler stood transfixed, his careful composure entirely abandoned as he stared at the spot where the jug had struck the wall. His hands trembled slightly as he removed a small notebook from his coat pocket, apparently intending to record his observations with the methodical precision of his professional training. Yet when he attempted to write, his quill refused to mark the paper, the ink seeming to dry upon the tip before it could flow. After several futile attempts, he replaced the notebook with visible frustration, his rational mind struggling to process what his eyes had witnessed. The servant girl Anne moved through these proceedings with an unsettling calm, her duties apparently uninterrupted by the supernatural chaos surrounding her. She swept the fragments of the broken jug with steady hands, her expression revealing neither surprise nor fear at the manifestation. This composure struck several of the witnesses as remarkable, given that she appeared to be at the centre of the disturbances. Some whispered among themselves about the girl's unusual reaction, wondering whether her proximity to the phenomena might indicate some deeper involvement than mere coincidence. As the morning progressed, additional witnesses arrived to observe the strange occurrences. Among them was Mrs. Sarah Payne, a widow of considerable standing in the local community whose reputation for level-headed judgment lent weight to her eventual testimony. She had come prepared to debunk what she assumed would prove to be either fraud or hysteria, armed with the scepticism of one who had lived through 6 decades of Georgian London's various enthusiasms and delusions. Mrs. Payne positioned herself in the cottage's main room with the strategic eye of a general surveying a battlefield, her sharp gaze taking in every detail of the scene before her. She noted the positioning of furniture, the placement of household objects, and the movements of the occupants with the thoroughness of one determined to uncover any trickery that might explain the reported phenomena. Her grey hair was arranged beneath a pristine cap, and her dark dress spoke of respectability and substance, lending authority to her presence among the gathered witnesses. The afternoon brought with it a series of disturbances that would test the resolve of even the most sceptical observers. Cooking pots began to dance upon their shelves without any apparent cause, their metallic surfaces catching the weak winter sunlight that streamed through the cottage windows. Chairs moved across the floor with a scraping sound that set teeth on edge, positioning themselves in impossible arrangements that defied both gravity and common sense. During one particularly striking manifestation, a heavy wooden table that normally required 2 strong men to move began to rock violently back and forth, its legs lifting clear of the floor before crashing back down with tremendous force. The witnesses observed this phenomenon from multiple angles, each searching for some hidden mechanism or human agency that might account for the movement. Yet their scrutiny revealed nothing beyond the stark impossibility of what they were witnessing. Mrs. Payne found herself particularly troubled by the temperature fluctuations that seemed to accompany each disturbance. The cottage would suddenly grow frigid despite the presence of a well-tended fire, the cold seeming to emanate from some invisible source that defied identification. Her breath would mist in the suddenly arctic air, while frost formed on the inside surfaces of the windows, only to disappear as quickly as it had appeared when the manifestation ceased. The servant girl Anne continued to move through these supernatural displays with that same unsettling composure, attending to her duties as if invisible forces regularly rearranged the household around her. When questioned by the witnesses about her experiences, she spoke in measured tones of the knocking sounds that had first announced the presence of whatever force had taken residence in the cottage. Her account was delivered with a simplicity that struck some as either remarkably genuine or carefully rehearsed, depending upon the inclinations of the listener. As word of the phenomena continued to spread throughout South London, the cottage began to attract visitors from increasingly distant neighbourhoods. The narrow street outside became crowded with curious onlookers who peered through windows and pressed against doors in hopes of witnessing the supernatural disturbances for themselves. Mrs. Golding found her modest home transformed into an unwilling theatre for forces beyond her understanding or control. The late afternoon brought with it Mr. Richard Fowler, a gentleman of scientific inclination, who arrived equipped with various instruments that he believed might shed light upon the mystery. His collection included a compass, several thermometers, and a device for measuring atmospheric pressure, all carefully arranged in a leather case that spoke of serious intellectual purpose. He approached the investigation with the methodical precision of the emerging age of natural philosophy, determined to apply reason and measurement to phenomena that seemed to exist beyond the reach of conventional understanding. Fowler's instruments began to behave erratically almost immediately upon entering the cottage. His compass needle spun wildly without settling upon any fixed direction, while his thermometers registered sudden and inexplicable temperature variations that bore no relationship to the warmth provided by the cottage's fireplaces. The atmospheric pressure gauge fluctuated in patterns that defied his understanding of meteorological principles, suggesting the presence of forces that existed outside the normal operations of nature. These instrumental anomalies coincided with an escalation in the supernatural manifestations that left even the most skeptical witnesses shaken. Plates and cups began to move across tables under their own power, tracing paths that seemed to follow some invisible choreography. Books flew open to specific pages as if guided by unseen hands, possessed of their own literary preferences. The very air seemed to thicken with presence, creating an atmosphere of expectancy that pressed upon the consciousness of all who entered the cottage. Mrs. Golding watched these proceedings with growing distress, her comfortable world having been transformed into something that challenged every assumption she had held about the nature of reality. The witnesses who filled her home spoke in hushed tones of their observations, their faces bearing expressions of wonder and fear that reflected her own inner turmoil. She found herself caught between her desire to end the disturbances and her growing realization that she possessed no power to influence forces that operated according to laws beyond human comprehension. As evening approached and the winter darkness began to gather around the cottage, the assembled witnesses prepared themselves for what they sensed would be the most intense period of supernatural activity. The patterns they had observed throughout the day suggested that the phenomena grew stronger as darkness fell, as if whatever force haunted the dwelling drew power from the shadows that gathered in the corners of the rooms. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge the understanding of all who remained to witness them, as the Stockwell cottage prepared to surrender its secrets to the patient observation of those brave enough to face the unknown forces that had made it their domain. Chapter 5. The natural philosophers arrive. The morning frost still clung to the diamond-paned windows of Mrs. Golding's cottage when the first carriage wheels clattered across the cobblestones of Stockwell. Word had travelled swiftly through the coffee-houses and drawing-rooms of London, carried on the tongues of servants and the quills of correspondents who delighted in tales of the inexplicable. By dawn's pale light, the narrow lane that led to the modest dwelling had begun to fill with curious onlookers, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the January air. Among the gathering crowd stood men of learning, distinguished by their powdered wigs and the weight of leather-bound volumes tucked beneath their arms. These were the natural philosophers of London, practitioners of that emerging discipline that sought to illuminate the mysteries of creation through careful observation and reasoned inquiry. They had come not as mere spectators to this supernatural theatre, but as investigators determined to apply the principles of rational thought to phenomena that seemed to defy all natural law. The most prominent among these learned gentlemen was Dr. Samuel Johnson himself, the great lexicographer and moralist whose Dictionary of the English Language had brought order to the chaos of words just as he now hoped to bring reason to the chaos of flying crockery. Beside him stood the Reverend Dr. William Dodd, chaplain to His Majesty, and a man whose reputation for eloquence was matched only by his fascination with the occult sciences. Their presence lent an air of scholarly gravity to what might otherwise have been dismissed as mere tavern gossip or marketplace superstition. The cottage itself seemed to shrink beneath the weight of so much attention. Built in the previous century of good English oak and local stone, it represented the modest prosperity of London's emerging merchant class. Mrs. Golding had inherited the property from her late husband, a baker whose ovens had once filled these rooms with the warm scent of fresh bread. Now those same rooms echoed with sounds that had no earthly origin, and the hearth that had once provided such comfort seemed to mock the natural order with its displays of supernatural malice. As the natural philosophers made their careful approach to the front door, the winter sun struggled to penetrate the low-hanging clouds that had settled over South London like a grey shroud. The air itself seemed heavy with anticipation, as if the very atmosphere had become charged with invisible forces. Frost patterns on the windows created intricate geometries that spoke of nature's hidden mathematics. Yet within these walls, mathematics appeared to have been abandoned in favour of pure chaos. Dr. Johnson paused at the threshold, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. The great man had built his reputation upon the careful examination of words and their meanings, but now he found himself confronted with phenomena that seemed to exist beyond the reach of the language itself. How could one properly describe the sight of a pewter tankard dancing in mid-air, or the sound of invisible footsteps climbing stairs that creaked beneath no visible weight? The learned doctor's companion, Reverend Dodd, approached the mystery from a different angle altogether. As a man of the cloth, he had long grappled with questions of the spiritual realm and its intersection with the material world. The Anglican Church had always acknowledged the existence of supernatural forces, though it preferred them to remain safely contained within the pages of Scripture, rather than manifesting themselves in the kitchens of respectable citizens. Yet here was evidence that the boundaries between heaven and earth were perhaps more porous than orthodox theology might suggest. Inside the cottage, Mrs. Golding waited with the patience of one who had already witnessed the impossible so many times that impossibility had become commonplace. The poor woman had aged visibly over the past few days, her face bearing the drawn expression of someone who had been denied the basic comfort of sleep. Her servant girl, Anne Robinson, remained huddled in the corner of the main room, her eyes darting nervously toward every shadow as if expecting fresh manifestations of supernatural displeasure. The cottage's interior revealed the careful arrangement of a household that had once known peace and order. Pewter plates lined the oak dresser in neat rows, their polished surfaces reflecting the pale light that filtered through frost-covered windows. Clay pots hung from iron hooks above the hearth, while bundles of dried herbs suspended from the ceiling beams filled the air with the faint scent of lavender and rosemary. Everything spoke of domestic harmony, yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lurked forces that seemed determined to transform order into chaos. Dr. Johnson entered first, his heavy frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene with the methodical approach of a natural philosopher. He carried with him a leather satchel containing the tools of his intellectual trade, quills and ink, foolscap paper for recording observations, and a small telescope that he had acquired from an instrument maker in Fleet Street. The great lexicographer believed firmly in the power of precise observation to illuminate even the most perplexing mysteries. Reverend Dodd followed close behind, his clerical robes rustling softly against the stone threshold. The chaplain's approach to the supernatural differed markedly from his companion's empirical methodology. Where Johnson sought to catalogue and analyse, Dodd hoped to comprehend the spiritual significance of these manifestations. He carried with him a well-worn Book of Common Prayer and a small silver cross that had been blessed by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. The two men represented different approaches to the great questions that had always haunted human consciousness. Johnson embodied the emerging spirit of scientific inquiry that would eventually flower into the full rationalism of the Enlightenment. Dodd, meanwhile, remained rooted in the older tradition that saw the world as a theatre for divine intervention, where miracles and supernatural visitations served as reminders of humanity's place within a larger cosmic drama. Mrs. Golding received her distinguished visitors with the weary courtesy of a woman who had already recounted her impossible tale too many times to count. The poor widow explained how the disturbances had begun with simple knockings and rappings, sounds that might have been attributed to settling timbers or winter winds if they had not displayed such obvious intelligence in their responses to questions. From these humble beginnings, the phenomena had escalated into a full-scale assault upon the natural order. The servant girl, Anne, remained largely silent during these initial explanations, though her frightened glances spoke volumes about the psychological toll that recent events had exacted upon the household. The child had been in service with Mrs. Golding for less than a year, having come to London from her native countryside in search of employment and independence. Instead, she had found herself at the centre of supernatural events that challenged everything she'd been taught about the world and its workings. Dr. Johnson settled his considerable bulk into a sturdy oak chair and began the methodical process of recording testimony. His approach to the mystery reflected the systematic thinking that had made his dictionary such a masterwork of organisation and clarity. Each reported incident was carefully catalogued according to time, location, and the nature of the phenomenon observed. The great lexicographer sought patterns within the apparent chaos, believing that even supernatural events must follow some form of logic if properly understood. Reverend Dodd, meanwhile, moved through the cottage with the careful attention of a priest examining a sacred space. His trained eye noted details that might escape a purely secular observer, the way shadows seemed to gather in certain corners despite the presence of adequate candlelight, the strange quality of the air itself that made breathing feel laboured despite the cottage's modest size. The chaplain's spiritual sensibilities detected undercurrents of malevolence that transcended mere physical manifestation. As the afternoon wore on, the gathering crowd outside continued to grow. Word had spread through the taverns and marketplaces of South London that learned men from the city had come to investigate the Stockwell haunting. Merchants closed their shops early to join the throng, while housewives abandoned their afternoon tasks to witness whatever revelations might emerge from the cottage. The narrow lane became congested with carriages bearing curious members of the gentry who had driven down from Mayfair and Westminster to observe this provincial mystery. The social dynamics of this gathering reflected the rigid hierarchies of Georgian England. The natural philosophers and clergymen occupied positions of obvious authority, their education and social standing granting them immediate precedence in any intellectual discussion. Below them stood the merchants and tradesmen, respectable citizens whose commercial success had earned them a degree of social consideration. At the bottom of this impromptu hierarchy stood the servants and labourers, whose first-hand accounts of supernatural events were simultaneously crucial to understanding the mystery and suspect due to their lowly origins. This class-conscious approach to supernatural investigation would prove both helpful and limiting in the days to come. While the presence of educated witnesses lent credibility to reports of impossible events, the underlying assumption that social position correlated with reliability of testimony would colour all subsequent accounts of the Stockwell haunting. The voices of those who had actually witnessed the most dramatic manifestations would be filtered through the interpretive frameworks of their social superiors. Inside the cottage, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as evening approached. Mrs. Golding warned her visitors that the disturbances typically intensified after sunset, when the boundaries between day and night seemed to weaken the barriers that normally separated the natural from the supernatural. The cottage's small rooms began to feel crowded with invisible presences, as if unseen watchers had taken up residence in every corner and alcove. Dr. Johnson maintained his scholarly composure, despite the growing sense of unease that permeated the dwelling. The great lexicographer had faced many challenges in his long career, from the grinding poverty of his youth to the social prejudices that had initially hindered his literary ambitions. Yet none of his previous experiences had prepared him for the peculiar combination of intellectual fascination and primitive dread that supernatural phenomena seemed to inspire in even the most rational minds. As darkness began to settle over Stockwell, the stage was set for a confrontation between the ordered world of Enlightenment thinking and forces that seemed to operate according to rules that no natural philosopher had yet been able to comprehend. The cottage waited in tense silence, its rooms filled with observers whose presence would either bring clarity to the mystery or add new layers of complexity to an already bewildering situation. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, drawn by the irresistible human fascination with phenomena that challenged the comfortable boundaries of ordinary experience. The pewter plates began to rattle softly against the oak dresser, and Mrs. Golding's weary eyes met those of her distinguished guests with an expression that seemed to say, "Now you shall see for yourselves what words cannot properly convey." Chapter 6. The Weight of Witness. The morning light crept through the frost-etched window panes of the Stockwell cottage like pale fingers searching for something lost in the darkness. Mrs. Golding had not slept. Her eyes, rimmed with the exhaustion that comes from 3 nights of supernatural torment, remained fixed upon the pewter plate that had shattered against the hearthstones. The fragments caught the weak January sun, casting scattered reflections across the rush-strewn floor like fallen stars in a winter sky. Anne Robinson huddled beneath her woolen cloak in the corner where she had passed the night, her young face drawn with fear and something approaching madness. The servant girl had become the unwitting centre of phenomena that defied every natural law the 18th century mind could comprehend. Each rattling pot, each flying dish, each impossible movement of household objects seemed to emanate from her presence like ripples in a dark pond. The cottage itself bore witness to the night's supernatural violence. Chairs stood overturned where invisible hands had cast them aside. The oak table, solid and reassuring in daylight, bore fresh scratches from pewter plates that had scraped across its surface without human touch. The very air seemed heavy with the residue of otherworldly fury, thick as incense smoke in a cathedral nave. Mrs. Golding rose slowly from her vigil, her joints protesting after hours of tense watching. The widow had lived in this modest dwelling for 7 years since her husband's death, finding comfort in its familiar walls and predictable rhythms. Now those same walls seemed to press inward with malevolent intent, and every shadow held the promise of renewed chaos. The streets beyond the cottage windows remained mercifully quiet in the early morning hours. Stockwell in 1772 was neither city nor country, but something between, a collection of market gardens and modest homes that served the great metropolis of London, yet retained the character of Surrey countryside. The residents were respectable folk, tradesmen and their families who attended church on Sundays and kept their houses in good order. They had no framework for understanding what had taken residence in Mrs. Golding's cottage. As the morning progressed, word of the strange happenings began to spread through the narrow lanes and across the common grounds where washerwomen gathered to exchange news with their laundry. The tale grew with each telling, as such stories do. But the fundamental truth remained unshakable. Objects moved without human agency. Plates flew through the air, furniture rearranged itself in the darkness, and at the centre of it all sat Anne Robinson, the servant girl whose very presence seemed to summon chaos from the invisible realm. The first visitors arrived before the church bells had finished chiming the morning hour. Mrs. Payne from the cottage, 2 doors down, came bearing fresh bread and curiosity in equal measure. Behind her followed Mr. Fowler, the carpenter, whose practical mind sought rational explanations for irrational events. They entered the cottage with the careful steps of those who fear what they might find, their voices hushed as if speaking too loudly might awaken whatever force had taken residence within these walls. Mrs. Golding received them in her best parlour, though the room showed signs of the night's disturbances. A brass candlestick lay upon the floor where it had fallen, and the looking-glass above the mantelpiece bore a hairline crack that had not been there the previous evening. She served tea from her second-best china service, the finest having been reduced to sherds during the supernatural siege. The conversation proceeded in whispers and meaningful glances toward Anne Robinson, who sat silent and motionless near the window. The girl seemed to have aged years in the space of days, her youthful features marked by an exhaustion that went deeper than mere sleeplessness. When she moved, it was with the careful deliberation of one who has learned to fear her own shadow. Mr. Fowler, his weathered hands wrapped around the delicate teacup, spoke of similar tales he'd heard from his grandfather's time, stories of houses where the dead refused to rest, where the natural order bent and twisted under the weight of unfinished business from beyond the grave. But even these ancient tales paled beside the violence of the phenomena that had claimed Mrs. Golding's cottage. As if summoned by their discussion, the disturbances began anew. A pewter mug upon the sideboard trembled, then slid slowly across the polished wood until it reached the edge and toppled to the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo far longer than physics should allow. The visitors froze in place, their tea growing cold in forgotten cups as they watched the impossible unfold before their eyes. Mrs. Payne's hand flew to her throat, her fingers finding the simple wooden cross she wore beneath her bodice. The carpenter set down his cup with shaking hands, his practical worldview crumbling like ancient mortar under the assault of the supernatural. Only Mrs. Golding remained steady, though her pallor spoke of the toll these events had taken upon her constitution. The pewter mug was followed by a wooden bowl, which lifted from its place upon the shelf and drifted through the air with the lazy grace of a leaf upon still water. It completed a full circuit of the parlour before settling gently upon the table beside the cooling teapot. The witnesses sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what their eyes had clearly seen. Anne Robinson spoke for the first time since the visitors had arrived, her voice barely above a whisper. She begged forgiveness for the chaos that followed in her wake, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she acknowledged her role as an unwilling conduit for forces beyond mortal comprehension. The girl's distress was genuine and heartbreaking, a young life caught in the grip of something that transcended human understanding. The morning wore on with additional displays of supernatural fury. Plates rattled in their cupboards. The fire in the hearth guttered and flared without regard for the wind or the quality of the wood. A brass pitcher filled itself with water from an unknown source, only to empty itself across the floor in a pattern that resembled no earthly script, yet somehow conveyed meaning to those who witnessed it. Word spread faster than fever through the streets of Stockwell. By midday, a small crowd had gathered outside the cottage, drawn by curiosity and that peculiar fascination that draws moths to flame. They came in groups of 2 and 3, whispering among themselves and casting nervous glances at the modest dwelling that had become the epicenter of supernatural chaos. The Reverend Mr. Broughton arrived as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. The parish clergyman was a man of learning and faith, his theology honed by years of study at Cambridge and tempered by decades of ministering to the spiritual needs of his flock. He carried himself with the dignity befitting his office, yet even his clerical composure showed signs of strain as he approached the cottage that had become a battleground between the natural and supernatural worlds. Mrs. Golding received the Reverend with gratitude tinged by desperation. She had exhausted her understanding of the world and sought answers from one whose calling placed him at the intersection of earthly and divine realms. The clergyman listened with grave attention as she recounted the events of the past 4 days, his scholarly mind cataloguing each detail while his pastoral heart felt the weight of genuine suffering. Anne Robinson knelt before the Reverend as he offered prayers for her deliverance from whatever force had claimed her as its vessel. The girl's faith was simple and sincere, shaped by the hymns and homilies of country worship rather than theological sophistication. Yet in her extremity, she displayed a dignity that would have graced a martyr facing the flames of persecution. The Reverend's prayers were interrupted by a fresh outbreak of supernatural violence. The very walls seemed to shudder as invisible hands swept dishes from shelves and overturned furniture with casual malice. A heavy oak chest slid across the floor as if pushed by giant hands, its iron fittings scraping against the flagstones in a sound like grinding teeth. Through it all, Anne Robinson remained motionless in prayer, her lips moving silently as she sought divine intervention for her torment. The phenomena swirled around her like a storm around its eye, chaotic and destructive, yet somehow centered upon her slight form. The Reverend continued his supplications, even as chaos reigned around him, his voice rising above the supernatural din in words of ancient power and comfort. As evening approached, the cottage had filled with witnesses drawn by word of mouth and an insatiable hunger for the inexplicable. Neighbours rubbed shoulders with strangers from distant parishes, all united in their need to see with their own eyes what defied every rational explanation their century could provide. They crowded into the parlour and spilled into the kitchen, their presence transforming Mrs. Golding's modest home into something resembling a pilgrimage site. The phenomena seemed to feed upon the attention, growing bolder and more violent as the crowd swelled. Plates flew through the air with increasing frequency, narrowly missing the heads of startled witnesses. A heavy iron pot levitated from its hook beside the hearth and remained suspended in mid-air for long minutes before crashing down with enough force to crack the stone floor. Among the crowd stood men of learning and position, drawn by reports that challenged their understanding of natural philosophy. They observed with the careful attention of those accustomed to seeking rational explanations for natural phenomena, yet found themselves confronting events that mocked their scientific pretensions. One gentleman, identified as a Fellow of the Royal Society, took careful notes in a leather-bound journal, his neat handwriting documenting impossibilities with scholarly precision. The servant girl Anne Robinson had become the reluctant centre of attention, her every movement watched by dozens of eyes seeking to understand her role in the supernatural drama. Some observers whispered of witchcraft and diabolic influence, their voices carrying the weight of centuries of superstition and fear. Others spoke more charitably of possession by spirits, viewing the girl as victim rather than perpetrator of the otherworldly chaos. As darkness fell once more over Stockwell, the crowd began to disperse, carrying with them tales that would spread through London's coffee houses and drawing rooms like wildfire through dry tinder. Yet the core witnesses remained, bound by a combination of fascination and genuine concern for the tormented household. They prepared to endure another night of supernatural siege, their presence both comfort and burden to the exhausted residents. The cottage settled into an uneasy quiet as midnight approached, the phenomena ebbing like tide from a storm-battered shore. Yet beneath the surface, calm lay the promise of renewed chaos, for whatever force had claimed residence in this modest dwelling showed no signs of departing. The weight of witness pressed down upon all who had seen, binding them together in shared knowledge of the impossible, made manifest in pewter and oak, in flying dishes and trembling walls, in the frightened eyes of a servant girl who had become the unwilling herald of the supernatural in the heart of Georgian London. Chapter 7. The Natural Philosophers Arrive. The pale winter dawn of January the 22nd crept through the frost-etched windows of the Stockwell cottage, casting long shadows across floors still littered with the debris of another restless night. Mrs. Golding moved carefully among the scattered remnants of her earthenware, her woolen stockings whispering against the cold flagstones as she gathered fragments of what had once been her most treasured serving bowl. The pewter candlesticks lay twisted upon the oak table, their surfaces bearing strange dents that no earthly force could have wrought. Anne Robinson huddled near the dying embers of the kitchen hearth, her linen cap askew and her apron stained with ash from the fireplace that had inexplicably belched smoke throughout the darkest hours. The servant girl's eyes bore the hollow look of one who had witnessed the impossible, her fingers working nervously at the coarse fabric of her woolen dress as she watched every shadow for signs of renewed supernatural activity. The cottage itself seemed to exhale with exhaustion, its ancient timbers creaking as they settled after hours of otherworldly disturbance. Rush matting lay torn and scattered. Wooden chairs sat overturned in corners where invisible hands had flung them, and the very air still carried an unnatural chill that made breath mist even as the morning sun struggled through the diamond-paned casements. Word of the Stockwell haunting had spread like plague through the narrow streets and coffee-houses of South London. Servants whispered of it in the grand houses of Vauxhall. Merchants discussed it in hushed tones at Southwark market stalls, and even the learned gentlemen of the Royal Society found their conversations turning to this most perplexing of phenomena. The supernatural had invaded the rational world of Georgian England, challenging the very foundations of natural philosophy. It was on this morning that the first of London's natural philosophers arrived at Mrs. Golding's door. Dr. Erasmus Hartwell, a Fellow of the Royal Society and student of electrical phenomena, approached the cottage with the measured gait of a man accustomed to observing the mysteries of nature. His black woolen coat bore the dust of the journey from his residence near Lincoln's Inn Fields, and his leather satchel contained the crude instruments of 18th century scientific inquiry: a compass, a thermometer of his own design, and various glass vessels for collecting what he termed atmospheric essences. Behind Dr. Hartwell walked two younger men, his students at the Philosophical Academy, where he lectured on the properties of magnetism and the mysterious forces that governed the natural world. Thomas Pemberton, barely 25 years of age, carried a leather-bound journal in which he intended to record every detail of their investigation. His companion, James Whitmore, bore a wooden case containing bottles of mercury, iron filings and other substances believed to react to supernatural influences. The trio paused before the cottage door, observing the building with the careful attention that natural philosophers brought to all phenomena. Dr. Hartwell noted the way the smoke from the chimney seemed to twist against the prevailing wind, while Pemberton sketched the unusual frost patterns that clung to the window glass despite the morning sun. The cottage appeared ordinary enough from the exterior, its whitewashed walls and thatched roof indistinguishable from dozens of similar dwellings that line the muddy lanes of Stockwell. Mrs. Golding received her learned visitors with the nervous courtesy of a woman thrust unwillingly into notoriety. She curtsied awkwardly in her patched woolen dress, her work-roughened hands smoothing her linen apron as she invited the gentlemen into her disrupted home. The kitchen where she led them bore witness to the night's supernatural visitations: overturned pots, scattered flour, and strange scorch marks upon the hearthstones that defied rational explanation. Dr. Hartwell began his examination with the methodical precision that marked all serious natural philosophy. He produced his thermometer and recorded the temperature in various corners of the cottage, noting with scholarly interest that certain areas remained inexplicably cold, while others maintained normal warmth. His compass needle spun wildly when brought near the kitchen hearth, though no iron implements were visible to account for such magnetic disturbance. Young Pemberton interviewed Mrs. Bedside Golding and Anne Robinson with the patience of a natural historian cataloguing specimens. He recorded their testimonies in precise script, noting the times when phenomena occurred, the sequence of events, and the apparent patterns that governed the supernatural manifestations. The servant girl's account proved particularly detailed, her terror having sharpened her observations of each impossible occurrence. The investigation revealed disturbing consistencies in the witnesses' testimonies. Both women described a progressive escalation in supernatural activity, beginning with mere knockings and advancing to the violent displacement of household objects. They spoke of an invisible presence that seemed to focus its attention upon Anne Robinson, following the young servant as she moved about her daily tasks and manifesting most strongly in her immediate vicinity. Dr. Hartwell found himself confronted with phenomena that challenged the emerging scientific worldview of the 18th century. The brass compass that had served him faithfully in studies of magnetic attraction behaved erratically throughout the cottage, while his carefully calibrated thermometer recorded temperature fluctuations that followed no natural pattern. Most disturbing of all, the mercury in his glass vessels remained in constant agitation, forming patterns that resembled no known physical properties. As the morning progressed, other curious visitors began arriving at the cottage door. Word had reached the coffee houses frequented by London's intellectual elite, and soon a small crowd of gentlemen gathered in the narrow lane outside Mrs. Golding's dwelling. Among them stood Reverend Dr. Samuel Westbrook, rector of St. Bartholomew's Church in nearby Newington, his black clerical dress and solemn countenance marking him as a man of theological rather than philosophical learning. Dr. Westbrook had come not to study natural phenomena, but to confront what he perceived as demonic manifestation. His leather satchel contained not scientific instruments but religious texts, a well-worn Bible, a collection of prayers for exorcism, and a small vial of holy water blessed by the Bishop of Winchester. The convergence of scientific and religious investigation created an atmosphere of tension within the small cottage, as two incompatible worldviews prepared to grapple with the same inexplicable phenomena. The philosophical divide between the men of science and the representatives of faith reflected broader tensions in Georgian society. The Age of Enlightenment had challenged traditional religious explanations for natural phenomena, yet supernatural occurrences like the Stockwell haunting seemed to resist purely rational interpretation. Dr. Hartwell sought to measure and quantify the disturbances, while Dr. Westbrook prepared to battle forces that he believed threatened Christian souls. Mrs. Golding found herself caught between these competing authorities, her simple cottage transformed into an arena where the fundamental questions of 18th century thought would be tested against supernatural reality. The poor woman's primary concern remained the preservation of her remaining household goods and the restoration of peace to her dwelling, but she recognized that forces far beyond her understanding had made her home the center of philosophical controversy. Anne Robinson observed the gathering crowd of learned gentlemen with growing unease. The young servant had noticed that supernatural phenomena seemed to intensify when she became the focus of attention, and the presence of so many observers filled her with dread. Her intuition proved correct when, shortly before noon, the invisible forces that plagued the cottage chose to demonstrate their power before the assembled witnesses. The demonstration began subtly, with a barely perceptible trembling in the kitchen crockery that might have been dismissed as the rumble of passing cartwheels. Dr. Hartwell's instruments detected the disturbance immediately, his compass needle spinning like a weather vane in a hurricane, while his thermometer registered a sudden drop of 15 degrees. The mercury in his collection vessels began to dance as though subjected to violent agitation, forming spirals and geometric patterns that defied natural explanation. Then came the sounds that had first announced the supernatural presence, sharp rapping from within the cottage walls, rhythmic and insistent like some phantom carpenter at work in the hidden spaces between timber and plaster. The knocking seemed to move through the structure itself, travelling from room to room with purposeful intelligence. Dr. Westbrook reached immediately for his Bible, while Dr. Hartwell frantically recorded observations in his leather-bound notebook. The crescendo arrived without warning as every loose object in the kitchen rose simultaneously into the air. Pewter plates, earthenware bowls, iron ladles, and wooden spoons floated in defiance of natural law, while the assembled witnesses watched in stunned silence. For one impossible moment, the very atoms of matter seemed suspended between earth and heaven, held aloft by forces that no natural philosophy could explain. Dr. Hartwell's scientific composure cracked as his carefully arranged instruments joined the aerial display. His compass, thermometer, and glass vessels danced through the air in a supernatural ballet that mocked the emerging principles of Newtonian physics. The natural philosopher found himself confronting phenomena that existed beyond the reach of measurement and rational analysis, challenging everything he had learned about the fundamental properties of matter and motion. The floating objects remained suspended for perhaps 30 seconds before crashing simultaneously to the flagstone floor in a cacophony of breaking earthenware and ringing metal. The cottage fell silent except for the laboured breathing of its occupants and the settling creak of ancient timbers. Dr. Westbrook clutched his Bible with white knuckles, while Dr. Hartwell stared at his scattered instruments with the expression of a man whose worldview had been fundamentally shaken. In the aftermath of this supernatural demonstration, the learned gentlemen found themselves forced to confront the limitations of both scientific and religious understanding. The phenomena they had witnessed operated according to no known natural laws, yet they had occurred in full daylight before multiple credible witnesses. The Stockwell haunting had presented Georgian England with a mystery that would challenge the era's growing confidence in rational explanation and empirical observation. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the cottage floor, the philosophical investigators prepared to depart, their notebooks filled with observations that would fuel debates in London's intellectual circles for months to come. The supernatural had invaded the ordered world of the 18th century, leaving questions that neither natural philosophy nor theological doctrine could adequately answer. The mystery of Stockwell would continue to unfold, drawing ever larger crowds of curious observers to witness phenomena that defied the very foundations of Georgian understanding. Chapter 8. The Natural Philosophers Arrive. The morning frost clung to the diamond-paned windows of the Stockwell cottage like crystalline tears, each breath of wind through the bare January branches casting dancing shadows across the whitewashed walls within. Mrs. Golding moved carefully through her disrupted household, stepping over fragments of earthenware that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The supernatural siege had entered its 4th day, and word of the mysterious happenings had spread beyond the narrow streets of South London like ripples across a still pond. Anne Robinson sat hunched beside the kitchen hearth, her woolen shawl pulled tight around thin shoulders. The servant girl's eyes darted constantly toward the ceiling beams, where only hours before, a pewter tankard had sailed through the air with impossible precision. Her hands trembled as she attempted to mend a torn apron, the needle catching on fabric made coarse by years of washing in lye soap. Each creak of the cottage timbers made her flinch. Each settling groan of winter-stressed wood sent her heart racing beneath her bodice. The first of the learned gentlemen arrived shortly after the church bells of St. Mark's had tolled the 9th hour. Dr. Samuel Jennings emerged from a mud-spattered coach, his powdered wig pristine despite the journey from his lodgings near Lincoln's Inn Fields. He carried with him a leather satchel, containing instruments of natural philosophy, a brass compass whose needle might detect magnetic disturbances, glass vials for collecting samples of air that might prove corrupted, and a magnifying lens ground in Amsterdam for examining evidence too minute for the naked eye. Behind Dr. Jennings came Mr. William Fortescue, a Fellow of the Royal Society whose reputation for methodical investigation had earned him invitations to examine various unexplained phenomena across the kingdom. His dark wool coat bore the dust of winter roads, and his boots left prints of London clay upon Mrs. Golding's scrubbed threshold. He removed his tricorn hat with deliberate courtesy, revealing greying hair bound in a queue with black ribbon. Mrs. Golding received these distinguished visitors with the nervous deference of one whose quiet world had been thrust into unwelcome prominence. She guided them through her modest dwelling, pointing out the scorch marks on the kitchen hearth where flying coals had struck stone, the scratches in the oak table where metal implements had danced across its surface, with invisible hands guiding their movement. Her voice remained steady as she recounted the previous night's disturbances, though her weathered fingers twisted constantly at her apron strings. The natural philosophers moved through each room with scientific precision, Dr. Jennings making careful notations in a leather-bound journal, while Mr. Fortescue examined surfaces with his magnifying lens. They measured distances between damaged objects, noted the temperature variations they perceived in different corners of the cottage, and recorded the precise time when shadows seemed to shift without corresponding movement of the candle flames. As midday approached, more learned gentlemen arrived. Mr. P.M.E. Thomas Whitworth descended from his carriage with an air of academic authority, his crimson university robes marking him as a scholar of natural philosophy from Oxford. He had travelled through the night upon receiving word of the Stockwell manifestations, driven by curiosity about phenomena that challenged the established understanding of physical laws. His servant followed behind, carrying wooden cases containing delicate instruments, a barometer for measuring atmospheric pressure, thermometers filled with quicksilver, and a collection of metal rods that might detect the presence of electrical forces. The cottage filled with the scent of pipe tobacco and the rustle of parchment as the investigators established their methods. They arranged themselves in the front parlour, where Mrs. Golding's few pieces of good furniture had been pushed against the walls to accommodate their equipment. Brass instruments gleamed in the weak winter sunlight that filtered through small windows, while quill pens scratched across paper as each gentleman recorded his initial observations. Anne Robinson remained in the kitchen, her presence both necessary as a witness and troubling to the learned men who struggled to reconcile her humble station with the extraordinary events surrounding her. They observed her closely, noting the pallor of her complexion, the way her hands shook when she poured ale into pewter cups, the manner in which her gaze seemed to follow invisible movements across the room. Yet their examination revealed nothing beyond the natural nervousness of a young woman thrust into circumstances beyond her understanding. The afternoon brought a demonstration that would challenge every assumption the natural philosophers had formed. Mrs. Golding was preparing a simple meal of bread and cheese when the cottage itself seemed to draw breath around them. The air grew thick and still, as if the very atmosphere had become dense with unseen presence. Dr. Jennings raised his quicksilver thermometer and watched in fascination as the temperature dropped by several degrees within moments. Then the performance began with subtle grace. A wooden spoon lifted from the kitchen table, rising slowly through the air with the deliberate movement of an invisible hand. It hovered for long seconds while the assembled gentlemen crowded in the doorway, their instruments forgotten as they witnessed the impossible. The spoon moved in precise circles, tracing patterns in the air that seemed almost purposeful, before settling gently beside a loaf of bread, as if placed there by careful fingers. Mr. Fortescue approached the table with scientific caution, examining the spoon with his magnifying lens for any trace of thread or wire that might explain its movement. He found none. The wood showed no unusual properties under magnification, bore no residue of wax or any substance that might have been used to manipulate it through clever trickery. He lifted the spoon, tested its weight, confirmed its solid nature, and set it down again with the bewildered expression of a man whose understanding of the natural world had been quietly shattered. The learned gentlemen arranged themselves around the kitchen table, like scholars attending a philosophical disputation, their instruments at the ready. Dr. Jennings positioned his compass upon the scarred oak surface, watching for any deviation of the needle that might indicate magnetic forces at work. Mr. Whitworth held his barometer steady, monitoring changes in atmospheric pressure that might accompany supernatural manifestations. Mr. Fortescue kept detailed notes, recording the precise time, temperature, and conditions surrounding each event. They did not wait long for another demonstration. As the winter afternoon darkened toward evening, the cottage began its strange symphony once more. Pewter plates rattled against one another with rhythmic precision, creating music that seemed almost melodic in its measured cadence. Earthenware jugs shifted across shelves with careful deliberation, never falling despite their precarious positions. Iron pothooks swayed beside the hearth, though no wind disturbed the air within the cottage walls. Anne Robinson pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her eyes wide with terror that had become all too familiar over these strange days. She watched the learned gentlemen scribbling their observations, their faces grave with concentration, as they attempted to apply rational analysis to events that defied rational explanation. Their presence seemed to lend a peculiar dignity to her torment, transforming her humble cottage from a place of supernatural chaos into something resembling a laboratory of natural philosophy. The investigators worked with methodical thoroughness as darkness gathered beyond the frost-glazed windows. They tested for drafts that might move objects, examined the cottage structure for hidden mechanisms, searched every corner for evidence of trickery or deception. Their instruments detected no magnetic disturbances, no electrical forces, no changes in atmospheric pressure that might account for the phenomena they witnessed. The cottage appeared perfectly ordinary in every measurable way, yet objects continued to move with impossible grace through air that showed no sign of disturbance. Dr. Jennings found himself particularly intrigued by the selective nature of the manifestations. Certain objects seemed favoured by the invisible presence, while others remained completely undisturbed. Pewter items moved frequently, as did earthenware vessels and iron implements. Yet precious items, including Mrs. Golding's few pieces of silver plate and a small collection of books, remained untouched throughout the ordeal. This selectivity suggested intelligence behind the phenomena, a reasoning force that chose its targets with deliberate intent. As evening deepened into night, the natural philosophers prepared for an extended vigil. They arranged themselves throughout the cottage with their instruments, dividing the watches so that every room remained under constant observation. Candles flickered in brass holders, casting dancing shadows that made their careful work more difficult, yet somehow more appropriate to their strange circumstances. Mr. Whitworth stationed himself in the front parlour, with his collection of scientific instruments spread across Mrs. Golding's small table. The barometer stood steady beside thermometers that registered the cottage's gradually cooling air. His notes already filled several pages with precise observations, measurements, and theories that grew more complex with each witnessed event. He found himself wondering whether natural philosophy possessed adequate tools for investigating phenomena that seemed to operate beyond the established laws governing the physical world. The cottage settled into the peculiar quiet that preceded its most dramatic demonstrations. Mrs. Golding retired to her chamber above, though sleep seemed unlikely given the circumstances. Anne Robinson remained in the kitchen, tending the fire that provided both warmth and illumination for the investigators. The learned gentlemen maintained their positions throughout the dwelling, their attention focused entirely upon detecting and recording any manifestation of the supernatural presence that had transformed this modest household into the most discussed mystery in London. Outside, frost continued forming intricate patterns on window glass, while winter wind whispered through bare branches. The narrow streets of Stockwell lay silent under starlight, unaware that within the walls of one small cottage, the fundamental assumptions about reality itself were being quietly challenged by forces that acknowledged no authority save their own mysterious purpose. The natural philosophers waited with the patience of true scholars, their instruments ready to measure the unmeasurable, their minds prepared to witness wonders that would reshape their understanding of the world's hidden mechanisms. Chapter 9. The Weight of Witness. The morning air hung thick with frost as curious souls began their pilgrimage through Stockwell's narrow lanes, their breath forming ghostly plumes in the January chill. Word had spread through London's coffee-houses and taverns like plague through crowded tenements. The Stockwell cottage had become a destination for those seeking proof of supernatural forces, drawing natural philosophers, clergymen, and common citizens alike to witness what many proclaimed impossible. Mrs. Golding stood at her casement window, watching the steady stream of visitors approach her modest dwelling. The pewter-grey sky pressed down upon the thatched roofs of neighbouring cottages, while frost clung to every blade of grass in the small garden plots that bordered the lane. The cobblestones gleamed wet and treacherous underfoot, yet still they came, these seekers of mystery, wrapped in woolen cloaks and carrying walking sticks, their faces bright with anticipation. Among the early arrivals was Dr. John Campbell, a respected natural philosopher from the Royal Society, whose weathered features bore the marks of decades spent in scholarly pursuit. His powdered wig sat precisely upon his head, despite the morning wind, and his dark coat spoke of comfortable means. Behind him walked the Reverend Thomas Hartwell, whose clerical collar caught the weak sunlight as he moved with measured steps toward the cottage door. The contrast between these two men of learning represented the great divide that the Stockwell phenomena had opened among London's intellectual circles. The servant girl Anne Robinson had scarcely slept through the night, her young frame trembling not merely from cold but from the memory of invisible hands that had seemed to reach for her in the darkness. Mrs. Golding had found her huddled in the kitchen before dawn, staring at the hearth where embers still glowed like watching eyes. The girl's dark hair hung loose about her shoulders, and her simple woolen dress bore stains from the previous evening's supernatural disturbances. As the morning progressed, the cottage filled with observers whose presence seemed to charge the very air with expectation. The oak beams overhead creaked under some invisible weight, while candles flickered without apparent cause. Mrs. Golding moved among her guests with forced composure, offering weak ale and bread to those who would accept such humble refreshment. The floorboards groaned beneath the weight of so many feet, and the small windows struggled to admit sufficient light for the growing assembly. Dr. Campbell positioned himself near the central table, producing from his leather satchel various instruments of measurement and observation. A compass needle swayed restlessly in its housing, while a small barometer showed readings that defied the stable weather outside. The natural philosopher's keen eyes missed nothing, noting every creak of timber and shift of shadow with scientific precision. His quill scratched against parchment as he recorded observations in careful script, determined to document whatever forces might manifest. The Reverend Hartwell occupied a corner near the hearth, his prayer book open in his hands as he murmured Latin invocations under his breath. The firelight played across his lined features, casting deep shadows that seemed to dance with otherworldly purpose. Other clergymen had joined him, forming a small circle of ecclesiastical authority that represented the church's growing concern over the Stockwell manifestations. Their whispered prayers created a low murmur that mingled with the natural sounds of the old cottage. Midday brought fresh arrivals, including several members of London's merchant class who had closed their shops to witness the phenomena firsthand. Thomas Whitworth, a prosperous wool trader, stood near the kitchen doorway with his wife Margaret, both dressed in their finest garments despite the humble surroundings. Their presence lent an air of respectability to the gathering, while their obvious wealth provided stark contrast to the cottage's modest appointments. The first manifestation occurred as bells across London chimed the noon hour. A pewter plate upon the dresser began to vibrate with increasing intensity, its metallic surface catching and reflecting the candlelight in hypnotic patterns. The assembled witnesses fell silent, their collective breath held as the plate lifted slowly into the air, suspended by no visible means. Dr. Campbell raised his instruments toward the floating object, while the Reverend Hartwell's prayers grew more urgent. Anne Robinson pressed herself against the wall, her wide eyes fixed upon the levitating plate as it began to rotate with deliberate precision. The girl's lips moved in silent prayer, though whether she sought divine protection or begged for a release from her torment remained unclear. Mrs. Golding stood frozen beside the hearth, one hand gripping the rough stone mantel as if anchoring herself to the solid world. The plate descended with dreamlike slowness, settling upon the table with barely a whisper of sound. The silence that followed felt heavy with significance, as if the cottage itself held its breath. Dr. Campbell approached the object with scientific caution, extending a gloved hand to examine its surface for signs of trickery or concealed apparatus. His instruments detected no unusual magnetism or electrical charge, yet the plate remained warm to the touch despite the morning's chill. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen through frost-clouded windows, the phenomena intensified with disturbing regularity. Kitchen implements danced upon their hooks, while chairs scraped across flagstones without human intervention. The very walls seemed to pulse with invisible energy, causing plaster dust to drift down like snow in candlelight. Mrs. Golding's earthenware vessels rattled in their cupboard, creating a percussion that accompanied each supernatural display. The Reverend Hartwell attempted an exorcism, his voice rising in ecclesiastical Latin as he brandished his silver crucifix toward the restless air. Holy water sprinkled from his fingers caught the firelight like scattered diamonds, yet the disturbances continued unabated. If anything, the cottage's supernatural residents seemed to respond with increased vigour, sending pewter cups rolling across tables and causing candle flames to gutter in impossible directions. Dr. Campbell maintained his methodical observations throughout each manifestation, his instruments recording anomalies that defied contemporary understanding of natural forces. Temperature fluctuations occurred without apparent cause, while his compass needle spun wildly during periods of heightened activity. The natural philosopher's rational mind struggled to categorize phenomena that seemed to mock the very foundations of scientific inquiry. Evening approached with grey clouds gathering overhead, promising fresh snow before dawn. The assembled witnesses showed no signs of departure, their fascination with the cottage's mysteries overriding concerns for comfort or safety. Servants arrived from neighbouring houses bearing lanterns and provisions, as word spread that the supernatural displays would likely continue through the night. The small cottage strained to accommodate its unexpected guests, while Mrs. Golding worried privately about the cost of such hospitality. Anne Robinson moved through the crowded rooms like a wraith, her presence seeming to catalyse each new manifestation. Observers noted how disturbances followed in her wake, as if invisible forces were drawn to the young servant's nervous energy. The girl herself appeared increasingly fragile under such scrutiny, her pale features drawn with exhaustion and something approaching despair. As candlelight replaced the fading daylight, the cottage assumed an otherworldly atmosphere that heightened every shadow and magnified each unexplained sound. The assembled witnesses found themselves speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb whatever powers held dominion over this humble dwelling. Outside, fresh snow began to fall in lazy flakes that caught the window light like scattered prayers. The temperature within the cottage dropped noticeably as full darkness settled over Stockwell, despite the roaring fire that Mrs. Golding maintained upon her hearth. Breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, while frost began to form along the inside edges of windows. Dr. Campbell noted these atmospheric changes with growing concern, his scientific instruments registering phenomena that challenged every natural law he understood. Through the long hours of darkness, the supernatural siege continued with relentless determination. Objects moved with purposeful intent, following patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random force. The assembled witnesses found themselves part of a mystery that transcended their ability to explain or categorize, yet none could bring themselves to abandon their vigil. The cottage had become a battleground between the known and unknown, with human understanding hanging in the balance. Mrs. Golding served her guests with quiet dignity, despite the chaos surrounding her simple home, her movements careful and deliberate among the floating objects and dancing shadows that had claimed her domain. The woman's strength impressed even learned observers who had come expecting to find either fraud or hysteria. Instead, they discovered dignity maintained in the face of incomprehensible forces. The night deepened around the cottage like a protective shroud, while inside candles burned with steady flames that seemed to defy the supernatural winds that moved through rooms without windows or doors. The assembled crowd had become a congregation of sorts, united in their witness to events that would challenge their understanding long after they returned to their normal lives. As the 10th chapter of this extraordinary tale approached, the cottage stood ready to reveal its final secrets to those brave enough to remain until dawn broke over London's ancient streets, bringing with it answers that few were prepared to accept. Chapter 10. The Silence Falls. The winter dawn of January the 12th, 1772, crept slowly through the frost-etched windows of Mrs. Golding's cottage, casting pale light across a scene of profound stillness. For the first time in 8 tumultuous days, no plates rattled upon their shelves, no chairs scraped across flagstones, no invisible hands hurled earthenware against stone walls. The phantom that had tormented Stockwell had simply ceased. Anne Robinson emerged from the small chamber where she had spent her final night as Mrs. Golding's servant, her possessions already bundled in a worn cloth sack. The young woman's face bore the pallor of one who had witnessed the impossible, her eyes holding shadows that would never quite fade. She moved through the cottage like a sleepwalker, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the profound quiet that had settled over the dwelling. Mrs. Golding sat at her oak table, her weathered hands wrapped around a pewter cup of small beer that had grown cold in the night. The landlady had aged visibly during the ordeal, her grey hair now completely white beneath her linen cap, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. She watched Anne gather the last of her belongings with a mixture of relief and regret, understanding that the girl's departure marked the true end of their shared nightmare. The cottage itself seemed to exhale with exhaustion. Broken crockery had been swept into neat piles, though fragments of pottery still glinted in the corners where candlelight caught their edges. The oak beams above bore scorch marks where flames had danced without fuel. The whitewashed walls showed dark stains where water had flowed upward, defying every natural law. Yet now, in the grey morning light, these remnants seemed almost ordinary, like the aftermath of a violent storm rather than evidence of supernatural intervention. Outside, Stockwell awakened to a world transformed by the night's silence. The crowds of curious Londoners who had gathered daily to witness the phantom's manifestations had dispersed, returning to their own hearths and workshops with tales that would be told and retold until truth became legend. The narrow streets bore no trace of the extraordinary events that had unfolded within the modest cottage walls, save perhaps for the unusual quiet that seemed to hang over the neighbourhood like morning mist. Word of the phenomenon's sudden cessation spread through South London with the same rapidity that news of its beginning had travelled. In coffee-houses and taverns, in drawing-rooms and market squares, the educated and common folk alike debated the meaning of what had transpired. Some declared the whole affair a masterful deception, pointing to Anne Robinson's convenient departure as evidence of human trickery. Others insisted they had witnessed forces beyond mortal understanding, describing scenes that challenged the very foundations of enlightened thought. The Reverend Mr. Brundle, who had kept vigil during those dark nights, returned to his parish with a profound sense of spiritual upheaval. The clergyman had entered the cottage with certainty in divine order and natural law, only to emerge questioning the very nature of reality itself. In his private chambers, he penned lengthy letters to fellow churchmen, struggling to reconcile his theological training with what his own eyes had witnessed. The phantom had touched not only pewter plates but the foundations of faith itself. Dr. Samuel Johnson, whose reputation for scepticism was well established throughout literary London, found himself unusually silent when questioned about the Stockwell events. The great lexicographer, who had dissected every aspect of human experience with surgical precision, discovered phenomena that resisted his analytical methods. In quiet moments he would recall the sight of furniture moving without cause, of water flowing upward against gravity's pull, and find his vast vocabulary inadequate to capture such impossibilities. The magistrates who had documented the disturbances filed their reports with unusual brevity, as if reluctant to commit too much of the inexplicable to official record. Their testimonies, sworn and witnessed, would gather dust in courthouse archives for generations, physical proof of events that defied rational explanation. The law, which prided itself on evidence and precedent, found no framework for phenomena that existed outside natural order. As days passed into weeks, the Stockwell cottage settled into an almost aggressive normalcy. Mrs. Golding secured a new servant, a practical woman named Martha, who approached her duties with methodical efficiency and showed no interest in the dwelling's notorious history. The landlady found herself almost disappointed by the profound ordinariness of her days, missing the terrible excitement that had transformed her modest home into London's most discussed address. Anne Robinson vanished into the labyrinthine anonymity of Georgian London, seeking employment far from Stockwell's narrow streets. Some claim to have glimpsed her in Southwark markets or crossing Westminster Bridge, but these sightings remained unconfirmed. The young woman who had stood at the centre of supernatural chaos chose silence over sensation, carrying her secrets into obscurity with quiet dignity. The physicians and philosophers who had flocked to witness the phenomenon returned to their studies and practices, many finding their worldviews permanently altered by what they had experienced. Dr. Johnson's friend, the physician Dr. Richard Brocklesby, spent months attempting to devise natural explanations for the events he had witnessed, filling notebooks with theories about electrical forces and atmospheric pressure. Yet privately, he acknowledged that conventional medicine offered no framework for understanding what had transpired in that modest cottage. Winter deepened across South London, bringing heavy snows that muffled the sounds of daily life and transformed familiar streets into alien landscapes. The Stockwell cottage stood quietly among its neighbours, distinguished now only by the occasional curious glance from passing pedestrians who remembered the crowds and excitement of earlier weeks. Snow gathered on windowsills where phantom hands had once pressed against glass, and icicles formed where supernatural waters had once flowed. The broader implications of the Stockwell haunting rippled through Georgian society with subtle but lasting effect. In scholarly circles, the event sparked renewed interest in natural philosophy's limitations, encouraging some to investigate phenomena previously dismissed as superstition. Others retreated further into rationalist certainty, declaring the entire affair elaborate fraud despite overwhelming testimony to the contrary. The philosophical divide between those who had witnessed the impossible and those who refused to accept such possibilities would endure long after the phantom's final manifestation. Religious communities found themselves similarly divided. Some saw in the Stockwell events evidence of spiritual forces operating beyond human understanding, while others warned against attributing divine significance to what might be demonic deception. Sermons were preached on both sides of the theological divide, with the phantom's behaviour interpreted as everything from divine judgment to satanic temptation, depending upon the preacher's disposition. The cottage's reputation proved both blessing and curse for Mrs. Golding. While some tenants fled at the mention of supernatural disturbances, others sought lodgings specifically hoping to encounter the paranormal. The landlady learned to gauge potential renters carefully, preferring practical souls who cared more about clean rooms and reasonable rent than ghostly manifestations. As spring approached and London's social calendar resumed its familiar patterns, the Stockwell phantom gradually faded from daily conversation, joining the ranks of metropolitan legends that surfaced periodically in tavern discussions and drawing-room entertainments. Yet for those who had experienced the phenomenon directly, the memory remained vivid and troubling, a reminder that the ordered world of Georgian Enlightenment contained mysteries that resisted rational explanation. The final chapter of the Stockwell haunting was written not in dramatic revelation, but in quiet acceptance of the inexplicable. No satisfactory explanation ever emerged for the events of January 1772. No scientific theory adequately accounted for the phantom's behaviour, No religious doctrine fully encompassed the spiritual implications of what had transpired. The mystery remained intact, challenging every attempt at resolution. Years would pass before similar phenomena surfaced elsewhere in Britain, each new case inevitably compared to the Stockwell precedent. Ghost hunters and supernatural investigators would cite Mrs. Golding's cottage as a landmark in the study of paranormal activity, though the landlady herself preferred to forget her brief celebrity and return to domestic anonymity. The cottage continued to shelter ordinary lives, its rooms witnessing the routine dramas of human existence rather than supernatural chaos. Children played in chambers where phantom footsteps had once echoed. Families gathered around the hearth where earthenware had once shattered without cause. Life resumed its natural rhythms, overlaying the extraordinary with blessed mundanity. In the end, the Stockwell phantom left behind more questions than answers, more mystery than resolution. The 8 days of supernatural tumult had demonstrated the fragility of rational certainty and the persistence of forces beyond human comprehension. Georgian London's confident march toward enlightenment had stumbled briefly in a modest Stockwell cottage, reminded that darkness and mystery still held dominion over corners of human experience. The winter wind that had howled through January nights gradually gentled into spring breezes. The frost that had glazed windows during the phantom's manifestations melted under warming sun. The seasons turned as they always had, indifferent to human struggles with the impossible. Mrs. Golding grew old in her cottage, tending new servants and welcoming new tenants, but never again experiencing anything more supernatural than creaking timbers and settling stones. The phantom had touched her life like lightning, illuminating hidden depths before vanishing into darkness. She learned to live with the knowledge that reality contained chambers she would never fully explore. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark.